Hello all and welcome to another Hyper Blue movie review. I'm blurring the lines a little bit with this movie review. Today I'll be discussing the 2017 movie adaptation of It Came from the Desert. Is it remotely close to the source material? And does it break through the video game movie stigma that most video game movies get? Let's find out. Now I hear what a lot of you are probably thinking. It Came from the Desert? Never heard of that game before. Tell me more, J-Town. Well, I'd be happy to. It Came from the Desert is a video game that was originally released in 1989 for the Amiga. A year later it came out for DOS, and then again in 1992 for the TurboGrafx 16, which you can kind of see in the background there. Although I will say that the TurboGrafx 16 version is slightly different than the original, and honestly the game is just all around bizarre. I'm most familiar with the TurboGrafx 16 version. I haven't actually played it, but I've seen a playthrough of it. As you can see in the back there, right next to the TurboGrafx 16 game, is a copy of the remastered, I believe, DOS version. In fact, that remastered DOS version is also available on Steam if you're interested. This movie, as far as I know, is based on the original Amiga game and not so much the TurboGrafx 16 Fever Dream. Now, as I mentioned in my Birdemic review, I like to intentionally seek out bad movies to find a diamond in the rough that's worth watching. Video game movies are generally considered to be some of the worst films out there, but there's got to be some good ones. I mean, right? In terms of It Came from the Desert, it's no Citizen Kane, or whatever is considered to be a great movie nowadays by movie critics, but it does provide a fun experience for those not looking for anything serious. Here's a brief synopsis of the plot. I'll get a little more in detail as we go, though. So the plot is a tale as old as time. A group of dirt bike racers decide to throw a party in an isolated part of the desert, and unbeknownst to them, there's a colony of giant ants that are about to cause havoc on the group. Right? Story as old as time. The film starts with a meteor that crashes onto Earth. The meteor changes or mutates some of the local wildlife. There's a group of scientists that contain some things from the meteor for testing and experimentation. It doesn't really explain what's contained, but they contained it. The group of scientists splices alien DNA that they found in the meteorite with DNA from fire ants and spiders. And why do they do this? They're scientists. I mean, who knows? The reason is nonsensical, and you honestly shouldn't put a lot of thought into it. I mean, there's giant ants running around. That's all you really need to focus on. The plot revolves around Brian and his inability to hit it off with his romantic interest, Lisa. Brian's best friend, Lucas, is a dirt bike racer, and Brian is an amazing mechanic that works on Lucas's bike. Lucas recently wins an important race, and the celebration is being held in the desert. See, now we're halfway to understanding the title. The characters just need to run into it. Lucas and Brian wander off from the party and eventually run into the government facility. That, of course, is when we get our first peek at the It. As I mentioned before, the It is ants. It's giant ants. So Lucas and Brian, and eventually Lisa, they fend themselves off from the ants inside of the facility, but it isn't too long before the ants start going after the partygoers. And of course, the first thing the ants immediately go for is the beer. Because duh. And then they begin to terrorize the people at the party. Okay, I'm being a bit tongue-in-cheek. The reason that the ants actually go after the alcohol is because someone made a special brew that is mixed with ethanol. You see, the scientists actually spliced another DNA trait into the ants so that the ants need to feed on ethanol in order to fertilize their eggs. The ants pretty much kill everyone in sight through a variety of different means, including just eating them, and also spitting acid at them. I'm not sure which DNA they spliced in to get acid spit, but they have the ability. The rest of the movie is spent basically with the main characters running around from the ants and trying to devise ways to stop them. The group eventually discovers a nest full of eggs, and, well, if they hatch, the world will be in danger. The group eventually manages to find an arsenal strong enough to combat the giant ants. They use this arsenal to fight back against the ants, and the rest of the movie is pretty much just ants versus humans. The story, at its core, is pretty much just a monster movie, but it's really a tale of someone just believing in himself. You see, Brian is unsure of himself as he attempts to talk to Lisa, but by the end of the movie, Brian becomes more confident and grows as a character. So, like I mentioned earlier, this isn't going to wow, movie critics all around. It's a popcorn flick. One where you just turn off your brain, sit back, and enjoy. I mean, yeah, it's cheesy at times, and the acting isn't necessarily the best, But, that's a part of its charm. I don't believe this will ever be a cult classic like the movie Birdemic, but I do believe that it's a good B movie. The dialogue in the movie's cheesy, but the movie is also pretty funny at times. As I mentioned earlier, the ants have a lot of powers that aren't really explained. They can spit acid, sometimes run faster than dirt bikes, and are sometimes intelligent. They're also pretty ruthless when they attack the partygoers. One weird thing about them, though, is they make this weird giggling noise when they're communicating with each other. It's a bizarre choice, but who am I to judge what a giant ant would sound like? You're also given subtitles when some of the ants talk to each other, and as you would expect, their dialogue is also cheesy and mostly funny. One area I feel like this movie could have improved upon was definitely the CGI. I'm a huge fan of practical effects, but I understand that's not always an option for producers or developers. The CGI just looks okay in this movie. It's not the best, it's certainly not the worst I've seen, but it's just not the best. That being said, though, I do think that the ant design is pretty cool looking. One other thing I enjoyed about this movie is the soundtrack. It's mostly just generic rock music, but I think that's fitting for the dirt bike scenes and the party scene. Plus, I actually like that music, so works for me. This movie also seems like it's a throwback to older 50s sci-fi movies as well. The type of movies where an everyday creature is mutated due to radiation or something like that. In fact, they even make a reference to the movie Them. I guess in a lot of ways, the game could be a throwback to the 50s movies as well. Actually, speaking of the game, to go back to an earlier question I proposed, does this movie break the stigma of bad video game movies? My answer is, I'm not sure. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm only really familiar with the TurboGrafx 16 version. If I were to compare this movie to the TurboGrafx 16 version, then yes, I think the movie is better. For one thing, there's a coherent plot.
Hold it! Where do you think you're going? Hey, you're the Lincoln kid, aren't you? We know all about you. You're on our list. Our death list.
But to compare it to the actual source material, I'll have to take a rain check. Although I can confirm after doing a little bit of research before this review that the original game does have a different plot than this movie. But I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with adapting the game's plot for the big screen. As long as it makes sense, though. In this case, I think the movie actually does it quite well. At least it has ants. Here's a fun fact for you, though. The original Amiga version of the game is shown during the end credits to this movie, so it's almost like you get a movie and a Let's Play. All in all, I didn't go into this movie with high expectations, and I left thinking that it was a pretty decent film, for what it wasn't. Is it going to wow most moviegoers? Probably not. But if you're looking for some mindless fun to keep you entertained for an hour and a half, this movie will certainly do that. Just don't go in expecting too much from it. Also, if you have the option, I definitely recommend watching this with someone else. It always makes for a better time when you can riff on the movie with a friend. That being said, I gave It Came from the Desert 3 drunk ants out of 5. Hope you enjoyed this review. As always, thank you for watching.